Hello, Void. So this week I started my pagan clergy training course, and one of the assignments for this week was to do a list of journal questions. So for this video, I wanted to talk about what I wrote for one of my questions. How did you come to paganism? Oh gee, where do I even start? I think there was actually several different threads that came together that influenced me coming to paganism. So let's start back when I was a really little kid. My parents weren't really church people, but obviously I did hear bits and pieces of religious ideas here and there. So when I was super little, I ended up with this weird idea that there was a mother nature, but also God. And I thought that Mother Nature was like this nice, benevolent, loving being. She was the one who created us, and I had this idea of her being in her little workshop in the earth, making people on her sewing machine. I had this little idea where maybe birthmarks were where she ran out of the original fabric she was using and just finished off with a different color, because I was kind of obsessed with my birthmarks at that time. And then God, on the other hand, I saw him as this mean dude who was just there to punish you when you die. I didn't really think a whole lot about him. So I guess my earliest conception of the divine was duotheistic. Then as I got older, I did try to look into Christianity a bit, because I had friends that were trying to shove it down my throat, telling me that I'd go to hell and all that because my family didn't go to church and I wasn't baptized. So in around the first and second grade, I find myself sneaking around to read this simplified children's version of the Bible that I guess some of my extended family must have given to me and my brother. But it never really resonated that well, and attempting to pray to that God never really resulted in feeling his presence or ever had any results whatsoever. And then around the time I was in 5th grade or so, I started exploring some other spiritual types of ideas, mainly like New Age kind of stuff that I eventually realized were fraudulent. Things like Crossing Over with John Edward on the Sci-Fi Channel, and some Sylvia Browne books that my parents had sitting around. So even though those things ended up being fraudulent, it did at least open the door for me to explore other religious and spiritual ideas later. And eventually I'd start reading about like paganism and Buddhism and mythology from different cultures. So in middle school, I was left on the internet unsupervised way too much. I suppose this was just an extension of being left unsupervised with books and TVs from before we had the internet. I got hyper fixated on all this paranormal shit, like ghosts, aliens, cryptozoology, the works. Eventually I ended up on ancient astronaut type websites and almost got sucked into that shit, but it did lead me to starting to read a bit about Sumerian mythology. Eventually, long story short, Inanna came to me in a dream, or I guess it might have been more like the weird state between dreaming and falling asleep. And she set me straight in no uncertain terms that the gods are gods and not aliens. So I started reading up on her from the perspective of a deity rather than all that paranormal sci-fi shit. It was really hard to find any good information on the Sumerian gods back then. This was the early 2000s. But I did eventually, in my teens, come across the Wilkstein-Kramer book. And I also somehow acquired an old issue of Green Egg magazine that had a feature about Inanna, featuring part of The Exaltation of Inanna by Enheduanna. At the time when I started reading about paganism, then there didn't seem to be a lot of people who worshipped her or the Sumerian gods. All I could find as a middle schooler about paganism was stuff about Wicca and maybe some stuff about the Greek and Roman gods. None of that really resonated with me that well. From the first time that she came to me, when I was maybe about 12 or 13, I've been praying to her whenever I felt the need to pray. Though I guess I always wondered if I was just making the whole thing up in my head. But in the last Circle of Inanna meeting that I attended, I found out that Inanna has apparently been really active in revealing herself to new devotees in the 2002-2003 time period, which was the same time period that I had my first encounter with her. So maybe I'm not actually crazy after all. So anyway, I was still exploring paganism in high school, and also I started exploring Buddhism a bit too. And with the types of people in my social circles in late high school and in college, Buddhism seemed more, respectable in a way. So I kind of pushed myself more in that direction, while secretly still praying to Inanna occasionally. But I wouldn't have wanted anyone to know that I was talking to a deity or any kind of supernatural entity. I did Buddhist meditation classes at the place where I did Tai Chi for a while in and after college, but eventually I slipped away from doing any kind of spiritual practice for a few years. I got interested in paganism again in my mid-20s, but it was limited mostly to just reading books and doing little rituals and spells secretly while my husband was at work. I guess I was kind of afraid that he'd think it was dumb and make fun of me for it. Then, when I had breast cancer at 32, I guess I just stopped giving a fuck about what anyone else thought about any of that kind of stuff. Long story short, I surrendered myself to Inanna, and I vowed that I would devote myself to her if she would help me get through all of that shit. And in the same time frame, my friend Shelly was also diagnosed with breast cancer, and she must have been going through similar spiritual difficulties as well, because she started inviting me to a bunch of different pagan events and things. That kind of made me feel like I had permission to more openly explore this path a bit, I guess. I should also mention that I met her at the Buddhist meditation classes all those years ago. I also met my husband through Tai Chi at the same place. So I started building my own practice of worshiping Inanna from the ground up. And eventually I went online and I found some Mesopotamian polytheist groups on Facebook, and I started lurking around those. That's how I found out about the Rod and Ring book, and I felt Inanna pushing me to get that book and to start working through it to better understand the other gods in her pantheon. Because at that point, my practice mostly only revolved around Inanna and Dumuzi and Shuber to a lesser extent. I also found out about Ishtar Fest from lurking around those groups as well. I was nervous to attend the first year that I attended because of my social anxiety, but I did, and it was just an amazing feeling to actually be meeting so many other people who loved Inanna as much as I did and who were following a similar spiritual path. Then I started going to the Temple of Inanna and Dumuzi devotionals every month after I attended the one they did during Ishtar Fest. And maybe a month or so after that, I joined the Circle of Inanna, which I also found out about through Ishtar Fest. I would eventually love to start an in-person Mesopotamian polytheist group if I could find enough people who are interested in the northeastern Ohio area. So I'm not sure if there would be enough interest in something like that to make it worth the effort. So if there's anyone else who lives around the Cleveland area and is interested in something like that, please let me know. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.